First plenary session deals with the economic challenges for the next 5 years. We have a group of 8 experts to deal with these issues. The panel will proceed in 2 parts. Each part approximately 55 minutes, with 4 speakers on each of the 2 parts of the panel. This first part will deal with some of the global challenges that we face in the international economy. I believe that the principle of an open world economy currently faces its greatest challenge since World War II. Not simply due to the trade policies of the Trump administration. All over the world, there are political movements, political parties, governments, increasingly powerful forces that are extremely skeptical of the process of economic integration that has characterized the world economy for most of the last 75 years. These populist movements vary tremendously one from the other, but they share, in my view, a strong distaste for measures that are seen as impinging on national sovereignty, national prerogatives, including, perhaps especially, measures having to do with the international economy. These populist movements also share, at least in my view, a strong distaste for what President Trump and others call globalist elites, which would be us, I think. The question that many of us are asking is what the future will bring over the coming period as the world economy faces these very difficult problems. Fortunately, we have 4 outstanding speakers and then 4 more coming up to deal with these challenges. I am not going to spend much time on the extraordinary biographies of the people that we'll be talking to. You can look in your program materials to get more details on what they've done over the course of their careers, but I will introduce them in order. First, let me just tell you who the 4 are. On my geographical left here is Kemal Dervis of the Brookings Institution. Next to him is Marcus Noland of the Peterson Institute. Next to him is SaKong of the Institute for Global Economics. And finally, but certainly not least, Qiao Yide of the Shanghai Development Research Foundation. They will speak in that order, and I have asked each of them to restrict themselves to 5 to 7 minutes for initial remarks, after which we will turn to some conversation among ourselves, and then, if time allows, open it up to the floor. So, Kemal, we'd like to start with you, trying to deal with what I think is one of the most troubling issues in the international economy today, that is the crisis of multilateralism. Kemal Dervis.
You could have said on my left without geography. Let me try to make 4 points. The first point is that when multilateralism is kind of celebrated among people like us here, in a way, we have to remember that multilateralism was for a long time not global multilateralism. The Soviet Empire and then the developing countries had a very small stake, very small thing to say on multilateralism. So it's a little bit strange when those who benefited the most from multilateralism now all of a sudden regret it's diminishing. Multilateralism, I think, probably reached its peak in the 90s, once the Soviet Empire had collapsed. And one could see, if not with Fukuyama, the end of history, one could see an overall world which was taking steps towards multilateralism, with China joining the WTO, with almost all countries in the world being part of the IMF and the World Bank. So there was a short period where multilateralism was truly international multilateralism. And it is probably true that if in the period before that, the United States and Western Europe and Japan had taken a more, let's say, generous or open approach to the overall world economy, we would have had a true multilateralism, which we actually never had. Now we are in a much more multipolar world, although the US and China are by far the two giants that are dominant these days by any kind of measurement one may want to take in terms of GDP or population and so on, weighted, and these are the two big giants. And then there are many medium and small countries. So the question is, will a new multilateralism come, with this time China playing an important role, and with the developing countries and the emerging markets playing a much more important role than before? I think that's the real question. It's not the question, have we lost multilateralism? We never had it in that sense. So that's my first point. The second point is more on the economic side. About 2 years ago, people were talking of the world economy slowing down. Larry Summers, Robert Gordon, many others had a very pessimistic view of the world economy. Robert Gordon wrote a book which is comparable in size to Piketty's book. I don't know, I haven't measured exactly which one is saying the rise and fall of American growth. And what I think what has happened in the last year or so, year and a half, all this has more or less gone. I mean, today, secular stagnation or the fall of the rise and fall of American growth are no longer à la mode. There is growth in the world economy. It's fairly widespread. It's led by the United States and China, but it is much more widespread. And therefore, the question of, what will happen in the future is much more open than it was 2 to 3 years ago, when the majority of analysts were thinking of a slowdown in the world economy. And here it's very hard to put everything into 7 minutes. I think one of the key issues really is the new technologies. Will the new technologies bring widespread growth or not? And I won't justify my opinion here. Maybe during the discussion I will. I think it will. The new technologies will bring rapid growth in the world economy. There was a time 2-3 years ago when one could have argued that this growth was confined to small sectors, small parts of the economy. But I think right now it has become so widespread that there's no question there is a very rapid growth potential in new technologies, and that these new technologies, contrary to what Robert Gordon said, are of the kind of electricity or the steam engine. They are really transformative in terms of what will happen in terms of world growth. But what is not clear is whom it will benefit and what will happen with income distribution. There are very strong tendencies in the new technology diffusion for income distribution to become even more unequal. And there's also a question mark whether the poor countries and even the emerging countries will be able to catch the new technologies with the same kind of vigor that they had caught manufacturing growth. And the fourth question, therefore, is that the new multilateralism that we're talking about has had, for it to take root and for it to fight the kind of populisms and neo-nationalisms that we see, we must talk not only about growth, but we must also talk about income distribution. Income distribution, both in terms of across the world, across borders, and income distribution also in terms of within country income distribution. The real challenge, I think, for the next 5 years is to arrive to discover a path and a set of regulation and a type of multilateralism that achieves that. And here, of course, I think one has to be very cautious, and one cannot be very optimistic about that.
Thank you. Seems realistic, mildly optimistic. Mark Noland, you have the unenviable task of trying to explain to us the current state and future of American trade policy. Take it away.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. In the interests of time, let me quickly tick off 4 challenges, 3 of which are interrelated, and I'll focus on trade, as Jeff indicated. The first is exit from unconventional monetary policy and rising interest rates globally are likely to set off financial crises, large and small. Olivier Blanchard and others on the program will address this issue, so I'll just skip through that. The next 3 are interrelated. The first is the rise of populist governments. Now, these are often described as conservative or right-wing, but they're not classically liberal. They tend to be highly interventionist. And these microeconomic interventions create winners and losers. The losers demand compensation. That sets off another set of interventions, and so you get cascading interventions. The net effect will be to reduce long-run productivity and incomes, but the constituencies don't really seem to care about that. The Trump trade policy in this respect is an exemplar. Trump launched a trade war with China. The Chinese retaliated against American grain producers. The response of the US government has been to expand income supports for farmers and is now contemplating increasing the requirement that ethanol in American gasoline rise from 10% to 15% to increase demand for grain. So in effect, a trade policy finds its echo in policies having to do with energy and transportation. And finally, the Trump trade policy can be seen as simply one component of a broader emerging Cold War between the United States and China. So now on trade policy, Donald Trump is a protectionist. He has protectionist views going back to the 1980s. He ran on a protectionist platform, and while there's some uncertainty about the administration's goals and how far it's willing to push confrontation or confrontational tactics in their pursuit, I don't think there can really be an argument about the overall thrust of that policy. The goals are reducing trade deficits, both globally and bilaterally, renegotiating or abrogating disastrous trade agreements, and rebuilding the manufacturing base by tearing up global supply chains and bringing production back to the United States. The tools are aggressive use of U.S. anti-dumping, countervailing, unfair trade practice statutes, and particularly concerning the use of national security statute section 232 with a focus on China. The use of 232 is particularly worrisome because the statute is very broadly written, and its use by the United States practically invites emulation from other countries. Renegotiation of existing trade deals, most importantly NAFTA, criticism of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism on sovereignty grounds, and a preference for bilateral talks over WTO or regional initiatives. The bottom line is the Trump administration is focused on undoing past deals and instituting border restrictions. It remains unclear whether this protection is a means to an end. That would be sort of the optimistic interpretation, that this is an elaborate tactical maneuver that will ultimately generate a more open system, or whether the protection is an end of itself. I'll come back to that at the end. Today, about 12% of American imports are under special protection. If Trump goes forward with his threat to increase the amount of Chinese imports under protection, that number could double. And if the administration goes through with the threat to introduce a Section 232 case on automobiles, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, that would be another 15% of trade. So altogether, the administration is contemplating putting 40% of American imports under special protection. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but I want to signal to you the scale that the administration is talking about. 8% of American exports are now under retaliation, and that figure will rise pari passu as the United States goes forward with these other protective mechanisms. The two key drivers have been the renegotiation of NAFTA and concerns over China. The NAFTA renegotiation, like the earlier renegotiation of the US-Korea trade agreement, had a net effect of weakening the agreement and moving the United States away from free trade. Maybe we should call the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement NAFTA 0.8. While the renegotiation did yield some useful modernizations of the agreement, these were taken part and parcel from the language of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which the United States pulled the US out of its first week in office. So while supporters can point to some good things in the new NAFTA, they're really a second best to getting those modernizations through TPP. The real innovations of the new NAFTA are twofold. One is the introduction of a convoluted sunset provision, which has the intent of creating uncertainty and deterring investment in Mexico. The second is the introduction of new, highly restrictive rules of origin in the automobile sector. These include higher value-added thresholds and the requirement that production be undertaken at a high minimum wage. The net effect of these new rules of origin is going to be to greatly increase costs of doing business in Mexico. Now, the tariff on automobiles in the United States is only 2.5%. So the companies would simply ignore these, pay the tariff, and go ahead and import the cars. So to prevent the companies from doing that, that is why the administration has introduced or is talking about bringing in a Section 232 case with a tariff of 25%. That has set off a scramble by third country exporters, namely the EU, Japan, and Korea, to try to get exemptions from that. And the United States is demanding voluntary export restraints as the price of that exemption. The sad part of all this is modeling suggests that it's quite possible by increasing costs of production in North America that much, and then by imposing barriers on imports, the effect of this policy will be actually to reduce production and employment in the United States in automobile assembly, parts, and distribution. With respect to China, the administration has cited 8 different justifications for its policy. These include reducing the trade imbalance, increasing exports, reducing Chinese steelmaking capacity, stopping intellectual property rights abuse, ending China's industrial policy, slowing U.S. FDI to China, deterring Chinese investment in U.S. high-tech, and terminating Chinese purchases of Iranian oil and gas. The question remains whether the threatened tariffs are a means to an end or a goal in itself. And if forced to choose, I would choose the latter, that the point is actually to reduce trade between the United States and China. And indeed, this can be seen as the economic component of the broader Cold War with China. So, conclusion, Trump is a protectionist. He set the world economy off on a trajectory towards much higher levels of protection. And while there is some possibility that this is all a negotiating tactic to gain leverage and will ultimately generate a more open system, my guess is the odds are what you see is what you get. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for that somewhat troubling interpretation of American trade policy, which I happen to agree with. So we move on to SaKong, who is, in some sense, at the center of the storm. Korea finds itself, both Korea and Asia find themselves at the center of many of these difficulties. And I suppose it falls to you to try to give us some sense of how things look from Seoul, from Asia more generally, as these troubling trends in the world economy take hold.
Well, thank you. Given the time constraint, if you allow me, I would like to make very general comments regarding the uncertain future world economic order and the global governance related issues, rather than talking about specific issue areas, perhaps that for later discussions. It is needless to say that we live in an economically highly interconnected world, and therefore to properly deal with any global challenges will help to be at the global community level policy coordination or cooperation endeavors. So my first point is that the most serious problem for the global community for the next 5 years will be what I call global leadership gap or leadership deficit, of course, caused by the receding or withdrawal of U.S. global leadership role, while no other country or no other countries try to fill the gap as yet. So the current global economic situation, the global economic situation for the next 5 years could be seen more like trapped in so-called Kindelberger trap, in which there is insufficient supply provision of public goods, most importantly, free trade and financial stability. So my second point is to strongly argue again here. I did it a number of times at this very conference, that like-minded countries at the G20 level, one might call them middle power countries, should exert a collective leadership, not only for themselves, but for the global economy as a whole. Of course, Korea is one of the countries should exert such leadership. This point will become more critical and persuasive if one looks at next couple of years global economic horizon from the cyclical perspective, to foresee big challenges for both emerging and advanced economies. For emerging economies, one can see high likelihood of financial crisis, big or small, as central banks of important advanced countries unwinding their very unconventional monetary policies. For advanced economies, it is inevitable to avoid policy-induced recession, while their central banks and the fiscal status have lesser room for maneuvering. So, what it means is that there's more coordinated and cooperated policy among the countries, particularly I have in mind is the G20 level countries. So at the time when global policy coordination and cooperation is needed, the global community today face lack of global leadership, which make the situation very bad. So in conclusion, in my view, next 5 years we'll see more like a Kinderberger-like trip, but I'm less concerned about Thucydides' trip as such. Well, let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard, including in Thierry's opening remarks, that one of the characteristics of the current international economic scene and political scene more generally is what some have called, including Thierry, developing Cold War between the United States and China. So I suppose it makes sense for us to ask you, Yide, how that looks from Beijing or Shanghai in your case.
I guess everyone agree now is a critical time of define the future direction of world economy in next 5 years. In this regard, China can continue to make a contribution in following 3 aspects. First of all, China should keep steady economic growth. In past several years, China make a contribution of 30% of GDP growth to global GDP growth. I clearly recall in 2015, the annual meeting of IMF and the World Bank, there's a roundtable discussion. A senior official from Indonesia say, you guys are talking about taping of QE. What I'm concerned is slowing down of Chinese economy, because 70% of raw material export from Indonesia go to China. So that's critically important. China still should make effort to keep steady growth, economic growth. So far is okay. In past several years, growth rate in China between 6.5 to 7%. But last quarter is 6.5%, which is the lowest in almost 8 years. So that's a big challenge for China to do that. Second aspect of the China contribution is to keep financial stability internally and externally. In past 10 years, the leverage ratio in China went up, particularly that of non-financial institution. The debt ratio for corp almost 160% of GDP, which is one of highest. China, good thing is the ratio stabilized now. They should do more. Externally, China should let market play decisive role to decide the level of exchange rate. The most important, as you mentioned, how China deal with trade escalation with US. Everybody know trade war was not initiated by China, but in this regard, China, I guess, can do more. In 2001, China entered in WTO. The GDP of China occupied 5% of total global GDP. Now is 15%. In this sense, China can do more in terms of reduction of tariff, more open up to foreign investors. Also, they can actively deal with complaint from other side, not only from US, maybe other countries, Europe, Japan. For example, they can carry the principle, competition neutrality. That means deal with all of the company, no matter is foreign or domestic, no matter the state-owned or private-owned, they should treat them equally. The Chinese government committed to do that. Of course, also industry subsidy have to be limited, transparency, and undiscriminatory. That means if they give subsidy to one company, they should give to all of them in same kind of industry. Of course, any disputes be resolved not only by one side, have to depend on both sides. So we will see what happens in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all four of you, actually, and also for keeping to your time limit, which means that we have plenty of time for conversation both among ourselves and with the audience, I think. I wanted to start by asking you all a question, taking advantage of the chair's privilege here. I think that among the four of you, you've identified two important sources of the crisis of the world economy or of multilateralism more generally. Kemal focused on the fact that, in some sense, the multilateralism that we experienced in the aftermath of World War II and have for the last decades was a multilateralism of the rich and powerful, not a multilateralism that benefited all, both within the major countries and in the world more generally. The irony, of course, is that the principal source at the immediate stage of the crisis is the apparent retreat from, or we might say attack on, multilateralism by the richest and most powerful country in the world, the United States. So I think that both of these positions are accurate. That is, that there is a problem in the multilateral order and in the international economic order more generally, in that it's seen as having served the interests of the rich and powerful, on the one hand, as Kemal has pointed out. And the other related problem, in some sense, is that the United States seems to be moving away from its many decades commitment to multilateralism. And I have a very simple question, and an easy one to answer, which is what should we do about that? Right? Whether we think of it from the standpoint of the United States, those of us who are in the US, what kinds of alternatives can be proposed, what kinds of solutions can be suggested that might help salvage the American commitment to multilateralism? And then more broadly, for those of you who think about the rest of the world, how might the rest of the world respond? I mean, SaKong, you sort of suggested the possibility of what I might think of as a coalition of the willing, leaving the United States out of a new multilateral order. That seems like a possibility. It seems like it is a possibility, as we are finding in the Iranian situation, that has grave difficulties. But I'd like to hear how you think the world or individual countries within it might respond to this crisis. SaKong, why don't you lead off?
I don't think any international community level endeavor should leave U.S. out. Persuade U.S. Leaders and the politicians to join in, and so without U.S., at least for next, if you look at next 5 years, the U.S. will be the most powerful and the most influential country in the world in any way. And China, second largest economy, but as I indicated, not yet ready in my view, and not yet willing to fill that gap left by the U.S. So, you know, when we had 2008, the global financial crisis, among leaders had this shared the sense of let's not waste crisis sort of thing. So they got together and they achieved much and saved the world economy only to the level of Great Recession rather than Great Depression. So now this is the time again. We need to make such an effort. But because of the lack of leadership exerted by the most important, the influential countries, so I think G20 somehow should be resuscitated again by, I cannot expect the U.S. take that role. So like-minded middle power countries should do something.
Well, that is a potential way forward. Kemal, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree that multilateralism, potent multilateralism, efficient multilateralism cannot be achieved without the U.S. For all kinds of traditional reasons, the size of the U.S., in terms of military strength, it still is way above anybody else. In terms of economy, it's more or less equal now with China. But I think leaving it out and trying to aim at the multilateralism without the U.S. Is not an avenue that one can follow. Actually, amazingly, and nobody has talked about it, the World Bank has achieved the capital increase under Trump's U.S. when it was unable to do that for a decade. So it's a very, very funny kind of situation. But the other point, that, again, I wanted to make is that we are on the cusp of a technological revolution where the US is again leading. China is also quite strong in it. But it's a kind of technological revolution which 5 years from now, if we sit somewhere in the World Policy Conference, we will say all this could happen in how could it happen in five years? I think it's a huge change. One example, a computer used to already beat human at chess, having learned from the experience of other chess games. But now you can teach just the rules of chess to a computer, and within 4 hours it learns itself the game and beats humans. I mean, that is the kind of thing we're in for. And that's where a new multilateralism is really needed, because when you look at one or other in genetic engineering, for example, you cannot have a world without some kind of order with this kind of technology. So again, that's another reason why we need the US in that world, because having that order without the US won't work.
It strikes me, though, that our past experience implies, I think, that these new technologies typically do have a distributional effect, as you've alluded to,
Oh, yeah.
that is not one of democratizing access to economic activity. So I don't see the technological innovations that you're talking about resolving this problem of multilateralism.
And that was my last point in my first
Right.
intervention. In fact, the challenges, the technologies are there. They're coming. We can't change it. They will accelerate, and they will change the whole productive sphere in the world. How to regulate them in such a way that there is a semblance of equity and balance in this new world of new technologies, I think it is the biggest challenge that humanity faces today.
Okay. Mark, with giving your pessimism, perhaps realism about American policy, where do you see things going, and where do you think the alternatives may lie?
Well, the simple, facile response would be get rid of Trump. The problem is that the default position within the Democratic Party in the United States is one of anti-globalization. So simply replacing Trump with a Democrat doesn't solve the problem. What has to happen is there has to be a rebuilding of a bipartisan coalition in favor of open trade in the United States. I think that would have basically two elements to it. The first would be the traditional non-populist conservative elements in the Republican Party aligned with business. And it's worth recalling that Vice President Pence was in favor of NAFTA, was in favor of TPP, supported the WTO, and so on. So there still is a traditional pro-business part of the Republican Party that would support open trade. On the Democratic side, there seem to be two elements of a potential pro-trade coalition. The first is simply to observe that cities tend to be more open to international trade than the rest of the country in the United States. If you think of a state like Washington, a city like Seattle, very open to international trade. So you have elements of the Democratic Party, for regional or sectional reasons, are still pro-trade. But the second thing, and I realize my opening intervention was pretty pessimistic, the thing that gives me optimism is that if you look at public opinion polling data, the most pro-globalization, most cosmopolitan part of American society are the young. They are much more open to the rest of the world than their elders. Even those young people who supported Bernie Sanders in the primaries supported him because of authenticity and free college educations. They supported him not because of his anti-globalization, anti-trade policy stances, or trade agreement stances. They supported him in spite of it. So I think there is hope for political renewal in the United States that would generate a coalition much more supportive of open trade than we have today. But that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take real political work.
Okay, that's a bit of optimism. Yide, do you have a similarly optimistic view on the international level with respect to potential cooperation either between China and the US or between China and other middle powers, perhaps?
Yeah, I will say China is one of beneficiary of international cooperation. Just, in the opening session, Prime Minister Cote d'Ivoire mentioned China made a great achievement in reduction of poverty. But the funny thing is, a while ago, in China, some corners, still some voice against the globalization. They don't feel happy. They feel China be take advantage by foreigner. But now, funny thing is, due to the escalation of a trade war, these voices disappear. We have some consensus. We think international order or international cooperation fundamentally is a beneficiary both to China, to the rest of the world. I guess that's also critically important for all sides, for the rest of the world to understand what the situation now China is facing. I guess Chinese government will try very hard to promote the international cooperation, or even in some sense, I will say they try hard to turn pressure, outside the pressure, into motivation to carry economic reform internally.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is, I assume we have microphones that can travel around. I can't really see out there. But I've seen a few people who would like to get into this conversation. Are there microphones in the audience? Do we have someone with a microphone? Anyone? Well, is that Jim? Yeah. I can't see. Okay, the microphone is coming. Why don't you wait? Identify yourself, please, before posing your question to the...
My name's Don Johnston.
Uh-huh.
And I've met most of you formally, but I was Secretary General of the OECD. But look, I have 3 points I'd like to ask you about. Can you hear?
That's better. That's better.
Is it on?
Yes.
One is Trump might learn. I mean, it's hard to believe that he might learn. But remember Arthur Vandenberg, who was the senator from Michigan, who was a staunch protectionist before the war, and finally ended up, when he saw the advantages to the United States, for example, that the Marshall Plan would bring by having a strong, united Europe rebuilt, he voted for it. He representation at the UN. He became essentially, he made a very famous speech of contrition in 1945. That's a possibility. I'd like to hear some of the comments on that, because the fact is that 20 years ago, we were all talking trade, not aid. We all thought that the developing world, the poor countries, would be brought in through the WTO process, which I think Trump would like now to dismantle. I mean, he's an American first guy. He seems to believe that it's better to be an 800-pound gorilla, in the ring with one other smaller gorilla, which is why he likes bilateral agreements. Even with NAFTA, think of what he did there. He separated Canada and Mexico out of in the negotiations, which was an example of his strategy. Went to Mexico first, then came back to Canada. Well, that's one issue I have that I'd like your view on. But Kemal Dervis made a point about the technology. This is extremely important, but for the United States, I'm reading every day almost about a lack of skill bases in the United States in engineering and sciences. There are 350,000 students from China studying in the United States, and Trump was even considering stopping their visas because he thinks they're stealing, ideas back again. But there's a dearth of skills in many of our Western countries. And finally, just one other point about the saying that you have to have the United States. I think the Europeans have a big role to play here. If you can get the European Customs Union to really act with one voice, it's the largest market there's ever been. And I don't think that's impossible. I think that the threat of Trumpism might actually bring that about. So you'd have another gorilla. Now, does anybody agree with that or disagree with it?
Well, I think the first question is, let's broaden it out a little bit. Can Trump learn is the way you put it, I think. But the broader question is, can American policy change under the current administration? Mark, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Well, anyone else, but Mark in particular, since you've thought about this
honestly,
lately.
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is one of the few things he seems to actually believe. And if I were to say that there could be possibility of change, the way I would put it is this. Donald Trump got elected president without ever holding public office and without ever running an organization with more than 300 people. So he was uniquely ill-suited to be president of the United States. We have a system, which I'm not defending, I'm just saying this is the way it works, in which the president of the United States appoints about 3,000 political appointees. The Trump administration was very slow to get off the mark in terms of making those appointments and getting them confirmed. Normal American administration takes 6 months to a year to kind of shake out, because you have people who worked on the campaign, you have people who worked in the transition, you have people who are now getting appointed. They have their own ideas, they have their own agendas, they have their own personal ambitions. So everyone's kind of scrambling, and there's a kind of winnowing process where ideas get discarded, individuals get discarded, and the government kind of converges on a line. This Trump administration has been very slow to do that. So you could say that there's still an unusually high level of internal disagreement, and that the upshot of these internal disagreements could be shifts in policy or shifts in personnel that would then manifest in shifts in policy towards a more constructive direction. But I'm quite skeptical that that will happen.
Other thoughts either on Trump's evolution or not, or on the technological or European issues? Kemal.
I don't think the Trump administration can change, or President Trump can change. That's a different statement from U.S. changing. I think the young people in the U.S. cities, the more dynamic parts of the country are all ready for change. But I do believe, and it's kind of repeating a third time, but I think it's really very important, that the productive sphere is changing. What is a monopoly is changing. And it is not in the direction of a more equal income distribution, more equitable kind of society. And that is partly why Trump won. So I think what needs to be addressed is not just the multilateralism or relationship with China, but what needs to be addressed really is how is humanity going to manage these new technologies? And here, again, in the end, I think, I'm not American born, the US will take the lead.
Thoughts? Go ahead. Yes.
Not on Trump. I don't know. Well, I think the economic consequences of so-called Trumpism may start to affect ordinary people sooner than many people expect. And so that may affect the Trump economic policy to some extent. And after this midterm election, I don't know what will be the outcome, but Trump will have to make effort to get, if he is interested in run for a second term. And so the economics may affect, may drive the policy changes, hopefully. But as Mark pointed out, but I don't think there'll be very significant changes given social-political dynamics existing in the U.S. and all over the world. That's why I'm more concerned about more really Kinderberger type of a situation where not enough leadership, not enough global public goods are provided. And so what that means is that at each individual country level, particularly in emerging world, will have to make extraordinary efforts in terms of education reform and strengthening social safety net and so forth. So I think the education reform is the main thing. That, again, is very difficult, but that, again, has a lot to do with the income distribution for the future as well. And you mentioned that, you rightly mentioned that China, of course, East Asia as a whole benefited the most from the post-World War II, the liberal economic order. So Asian countries, including China, should be ready to share the burden of providing public goods. It's not just providing international leadership as such, but I think opening up your own market and implementing your structural adjustment is one way sharing the burden of, for the global group.
Yide, yes. It's a challenge.
CSIS in Washington, D.C. Had a seminar, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, invite all of the former representative USTR to share their idea. The moderator asked the first question. He said, don't criticize the current policy. I just ask you, do you think these tendencies will continue, go on, or you think it's just temporarily? I saw 2 or 3 of them, several of them say, we don't know. We don't know. So I think the same question many times. I think it's dependent in which level. In some issue, I do think Trump administration wouldn't change. Some idea he just stick. Some idea he hold 30 years ago, even very much wrong, he still stick that. Mm-hmm. But some issue he may change his mind, particularly maybe at the end of next year or 2020, U.S. economy get suffering. I don't think he will continue to do everything now. He may want to do something, want to negotiate with China. That's my answer.
Well, certainly, whatever the goals of the administration or Trump himself may be, facing difficulties on the domestic economic or political front or technological change or internationally could force a change in government policy. There's no question about that. I want to move to, I think, what will be our last question since we need to move to the second panel. If you could identify yourself and then ask your question.
Philippe Chalmin from Paris Dauphine University. My question will be quite easy, not to answer, but to present. Are we ready and can we cope with the next financial crisis? I mean, in 2008, we had a crisis coming from the US and the subprime problem, but it was fairly easy to just have a recession and not a depression with old Keynesian policies. You lower your interest rates and you float the economy with liquidities and quantitative easing and the rest. Just right now, we have a huge problem of debt. Our public deficits in many countries are fairly high, 4% in the States. So if we had a new financial crisis coming from where, I don't know, perhaps students' loan in the States or something else, could we cope with a financial crisis which would be not only perhaps a recession, but eventually a depression?
I think that's an extraordinarily important and good question. I would disagree with the notion that it was easy to confront the crisis in 2008, 2009. I think many of us were surprised at how successful the cooperation was and expected things to go much worse. But I suppose we can turn again to the panel and ask if we are, in fact, prepared for whatever the next crisis may look like, which we don't know. But Kemal?
Well, I think, as one says very often, the crises never quite look the same as they were in the past. The high level of debt per se, I don't think is too worrisome. What is worrisome is the composition of debt and who owes how much to whom. But I believe that in the near future, at least, we won't have another edition of a 2008 crisis. We will have some other crises, which we may not foresee right now. But I think the financial sector has learned, also for its own benefit, of course, it does some of the same things again. But I don't think we will get a re-edition of the 2008 crisis. And total debt, I one has to remember is you know, it's always debt from somebody to somebody. So it all depends on who owes what to whom.
Sure. Mark?
I think that the questioner correctly identifies the problem that we have very low interest rates and a lot of debt. So we don't have a lot of space to respond, although I would defer to others who know more about that than I do. But in terms of this session, what I think is really striking to me is that we are getting this level of political polarization and populism under relatively good macroeconomic circumstances. If we were to get a financial crisis in the United States or other big countries, and there really was a significant downturn, one hates to think about how that might manifest politically. If anything, the last few years have made me reassess my beliefs about human nature. Views appear to be much more fluid than I would have expected. It is incredible to see polling data in the United States that now shows a large majority of Republican-affiliated voters regard Vladimir Putin, a former KGB colonel, as a good guy. And Trump is so polarizing that the support for free trade, despite what I said at the beginning, support for free trade is now higher among Democrat-affiliated voters
Twice as high
than it is among Republicans. And I think we are in a truly dangerous situation. And the interaction of that degree of political polarization and fluidity with a real financial crisis could be very, very dangerous indeed.
After 2008 global financial crisis, we all know that financial institutions, banks are better capitalized and are sounder now. But that doesn't mean that future crises will not happen, occur. As I alluded to during my initial the remarks, I think there is more likelihood of having financial crisis, small or big, already happening some countries now. In next 2 or 3 years' time, not 5 years, maybe next. So, to prevent that or to help remedy the situation, I think this international cooperation is very important. I mean, theoretically, but what will happen is a different issue, but we have to make an effort. And for example, very simple, swap arrangement. I've been always saying the swap arrangement is least costly because the bigger the arrangement, bilaterally or plurilaterally, the lower probability of utilizing it. So it's a costless insurance. And so this kind of arrangement can be done among central banks. And so there are ways of dealing with this possible crisis.
Many people point to Chinese financial conditions as one of the more worrisome components of the international scene. Where do things look like from your perspective?
I guess after all the break of global financial crisis, international community have already done lots. For example, set up a G20, FSB, global financial safety net at the center. But it's still hard to identify which way or when the financial crisis will break out. But what I'm concerned is maybe it happened not due to one single fact, maybe some overlapping fact. For example, if 2020, the US economy coming down, Chinese economy coming down, that will create a very dangerous situation. A financial crisis will be out. Also, if escalation, trade war between US and China cannot be resolved soon, it will drag on whole global economy. That something factor overlapping, which will provide some environment for occurrence of financial crisis.
It's undoubtedly true. Well, I saw dozens of hands up, and I'm very sorry that we can't take, not even all, any more questions, because we do need to move on to our second session. I will point out that this is only the first plenary session of the day, and there are other sessions coming up. There are also side sessions, one of which I should promote because it's on finance, specifically for those of you interested in these issues. We do need to move on. We'll take a very short break, not even a break from your standpoint, only a break in order to transfer the 4 on the panel to the next 4. So thank you all for your participation, and we'll move on. This next portion of our panel, the second portion of our panel, thinking about economic challenges over the next 5 years, brings together 4 experts on specific or more specific topics, we may say, in the international economy. And I'm going to introduce them again, one by one, and then they'll each make a presentation. So first here on my left is Karl Brauner of the WTO. Second is Patrick de Castelbajac from Airbus, who is in charge at Airbus Industry of strategy and international affairs. Finally, next, Suzanne Hayden, who used to be a senior prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice and now is on the PMI Impact Expert Council. And finally, at the far left, Ito Motoshige, who is currently on the Council on Economic and Fiscal Policy in Japan. And as before, each of them will take 5 to 7 minutes to address specific problems. I'm going to ask Karl, who comes to us from the WTO, to address what is a question that was raised in the previous panel and that I think is on the minds of many of us, which is what on earth will become of the WTO in the current situation?
Yeah, thank you very much. I must confess we are in crisis mode. We are in crisis mode because we are about to lose one of the features that distinguishes the WTO as an international organization from other international organizations. We have a well-functioning dispute settlement mechanism. When you join the WTO as a state, you subject yourself to this compulsory dispute settlement. So if a state wants to sue another one, there is no way out. You cannot prevent that litigation is going to take place. Because the others were also very disciplined in using only 5 to 7 minutes. I will not explain how the system works. I will only say that it has been very successful over the last 23 years. It has been used more than 530 times. It is also used by countries who have their own bilateral arrangements among themselves and their own dispute settlement, but they prefer to come to Geneva and have their dispute settled there. We have a very good compliance rate. States comply also in reasonable times, and now all this is in danger because the appeal function in this system is losing heads. We have 7 members of the appellate bodies. Normally, right now, we only have 3. There are 4 vacancies, and the US blocks the filling of those 4 vacancies. So the question is, why does the US do it? And I think we have already heard 2 significant answers to this question. One has to do with sovereignty, and the other has to do with China. It was, in fact, the US who, at the end of the Uruguay round, demanded the establishment of an appellate body to solve disputes that would arise in the WTO. And the idea of it were the Europeans who were afraid of it because of their agricultural policy. But the Americans insisted on it, and the Americans had the idea there was massive liberalization through the Uruguay round, through the establishment of the WTO, and this would be matched with targeted protection. So they should have strong instruments of anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, so that wherever an unfair situation would occur, they could protect themselves reasonably. They were already in the early days of this dispute settlement mechanism disappointed because the court took, sorry, I used the word court. The Americans would never call it a court. It's a dispute settlement mechanism. It used a methodology in determining dumping which weakened the instrument of anti-dumping. And on the subsidy front, and this has a lot to do with China, on the subsidy front, they developed approach to determining what illegal subsidy is, that also looked at who dispenses the money. They requested a public body to dispense the money, and because there are many ways of moving money into your economy, the way of one could attack subsidies was limited. So the Americans were not happy with, they were disappointed in their expectation of having massive liberalization and targeted protection. The protection was too weak. They also criticized that this institution, the appellate body, developed the law. They filled gaps. They call, the Americans attack it as overreach. One must understand that this is the only, let me call it court for the sake of provocation, the only court to which the Americans subjected themselves to, the only international court. And they introduced a number of ideas by which they would make sure that this would not lead to an extended transfer of sovereignty away from the US. The Europeans have no problem with it because the Europeans are used to their European Court of Justice all the time deciding in favor of the Union and taking small pieces of sovereignty away from the member states. But for the US, this was a problem, is a problem, and has already been a problem under the Obama administration. So there are other issues. I only want to say, while we are sitting here in Canada, there are a group of ministers joined together under the invitation of Canada to discuss reforms. The Europeans have put something on the table which they think takes on board all the grievances of the Americans. Is so fantastic that the Americans, I spoke to an author, he really thinks that they could not reject it. So if we could really get together, create a spirit of cooperation, then reforms would be possible. There is, on the technical level in the WTO right now, a strong spirit of cooperation. But whether this transfers to the higher political level must be seen in future. If we do not manage reform, then we will get back to the rule of the jungle. For me, this would be a regression of civilization, and we would replace the rule of law. The WTO is about rules-guided globalization. We would replace the rule of the law by the deal of the day, and that would be very bad. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that's an optimistic interpretation. I certainly agree that the rule of law is better than the rule of the jungle. I would point, and that many of the proposals that have been suggested are, in fact, workable and sensible. I would point out, in the spirit of Mark Noland's pessimism, that the administration, or at least members of the administration, have said that they reject a rule-based international economic order, which is a problem. So one thing is what makes sense intellectually and even normatively, and the other is what is feasible politically, which brings me to Patrick, who faces a similar problem, I think, with what makes sense on the one hand, as opposed to what is politically possible. Patrick, you are at Airbus in the center of the storm that is building and has been building since the referendum over what Brexit implies for both the European, and I use Europe in the geographical sense to include the United Kingdom, both the European economy and the European business community. Airbus, as we all know, is a tightly integrated organization. What are you going to do when whatever happens, happens?
Well, I think first what we wanted to, when I discussed with Thierry and Nicolas, we said we want to give a kind of an industrial view, an European industrial company view on what's going on. Because Airbus has the privilege of being the Europe that works. And our success has been based over the last 40 years of the free flow of people, goods, services, assets throughout Europe. We've got 14,000 employees in the UK. To give you an idea, that means 80,000 trips of Airbus employee over the channel every year. We've got over 2,300 suppliers. So it is an absolutely integrated component of what we do. There's 15 billion of trade going across the channel on a yearly basis. The issue today is a simple one. Well, it's not a simple one, but it's when we build an aircraft, we have between 1 and 2 million parts for every aircraft. So every part has to be just on time. You need, imagine the logistics to get these 2 million parts all across the world and across Europe coming at one point in time on quality at a given place. So obviously, if you want to start to build buffer stocks everywhere in terms of working capital, it's just simply a killer. You cannot have 2 million parts stocked all over Europe because you have risk of disruption in the UK. So frictionless trade is absolutely key because we live in a very competitive world. We are a business which is, sorry to say, not efficiently supported by our political states, contrary to our competitors. And so we absolutely need to deliver, and we need to deliver according to a very high standards of performance. So we're very worried today because if you look at the traffic and logistics, it's mostly trucks today. And there are 6,000 trucks going over the border every day. So if you take, even if you say, okay, the goods can go in, but the truck will be controlled? Will the driver of the truck, if it's French or Moroccan or Spanish, will they be controlled? And if they control, you say if they're very efficient, you need maybe 2 minutes per truck. And 2 minutes per truck means 30 miles queue before Dover, 50 kilometers of queue every day. Will that disrupt every business? Well, probably so. The other thing which concerns us a little bit is, again, I'm not talking tariff here, I'm talking administration papers. We are going to have to build roughly 250,000 administrative documents per year now. We were in a place where when we were exporting across the channel, we have a form filled once a month with a dozen of information. Now, such form will have to go across the border with every part with 54 data points. So the level of complexity, the level of inefficiency and administrative load is huge. And that is not Airbus, that is for any company doing business with the UK. So the challenge for us, and we raised our hand a while ago because we are very concerned about the level of unpreparedness. We are working at full capacity on Airbus. This year, we're targeting selling and delivering 800 aircraft. That means more than 3 aircraft per working day. So if we have 1 week of delay, we cannot recover that week because we are running at full capacity. So 1 week of delay means we're going to lose 1 billion. And we're very, very lucky if with the Brexit, as we're going into today, will be only 1 week of delay. So it will massively harm not only UK companies, but also, I think, European competition. And another point, which is aside from the industrial, which I think relates to every industry which is heavily regulated, like the pharmaceutical, chemicals, defense, and so on. To give you an idea, when every part on the aircraft has to be certified by the European Aerospace Safety Agency. The day a part is not certified, the aircraft cannot fly, the world over, not only in Europe. Until very recently, the point was the British expressed their willingness to go out of EASA because with this authority goes the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And if you deny the jurisdiction, you cannot be part of it. But that would have meant that, again, anywhere in the world, once you have to change to put a British part in the aircraft is not certified. If it's not certified, it cannot fly. So we've been working with months now with EASA and the British and many of our suppliers. So now, a couple of weeks ago, there is an agreement in principle on how it should work. And the EASA very constructively accept to give a third country approval to the UK suppliers. But there's, again, more than 2,000 suppliers. There are more than 10,000 parts, and we've got less than 6 months now to implement this if we don't want the aircraft to be grounded. And if you take if you go into the UK today, the head of custom recently said that it will take 4 to 5 years to set up a custom system that would work. And imagine for the SME in the UK. The SME in the UK grew in a world when they don't have to bother about customs. I don't even mean tariff, I mean customs. Because they do business with the neighboring countries in EU and it's free trade and it's easy. But none of them know today what will happen after the 29th of March. None of them know today if they have to invest in certain system and which system to do what will be the delay, how do you manage your production, how do you manage your sale, your after sale, your support. Nobody knows. Same thing for the airport. There was actually the day before yesterday, the National UK Audit Agency that said the airport will need a minimum of 3 years to get the appropriate border system. IATA, which is the UN for aviation, said that they were concerned at what will happen after 29th of March. Today, no one knows what will happen. And the UK Transport Department, again this week, said that they had great concern about what will happen to aviation, but also to train on, no norms, no security, what happened with the insurance and so on. So I think the level of uncertainty for a no-deal Brexit is extremely significant. And we feel as an industrial company in the UK that maybe today it's not exactly fully apprehended by all stakeholders. And we feel today that even no deal, actually even a bad deal could be better than no deal. Again, it's easy for me, I'm not a politician, but it's certainly something we do. So very quickly, what we're all doing now, same in the automotive, same of what we do, we are building buffers. So we're spending €1 billion in buffers now, both sides of the border. And that impacts our ability to invest. We're in a very competitive industry. We'd rather invest 1 billion in R&D, 1 billion to be more competitive, rather than 1 billion to build stocks. But we have to do it. We're investing also a very significant amount to try to anticipate on what could be the custom systems and how can we digitalize it and having something flexible so whatever the countries will come up with, we can adjust and react fast. We are trying to help our suppliers also to get ready, but most of them are not today. And so, to conclude very quickly, I extremely worried by the level of readiness of our governments on the issue, and some also of the industrial and the businesses, which I think listen a little bit too much to the flow of information saying, it'll be okay. Well, actually, hopefully it will be okay, but nobody can know today how it will be okay. And of course, I'm conscious that Airbus is an extreme example because we're very integrated, very European, but we're not the only one. I think in automotive, in pharmaceutical, in space, in defense, in many other industries, we find the same concern and the same and the same worries. And I think for all of us, for all the large companies today, these uncertainties and the possible consequences force us to revise our view on what we will do in the UK tomorrow. Clearly, today we have fantastic people there. I think it's the most competitive place for all Airbus in Europe by a significant margin. But if the hard Brexit happens, we'll have to revise everything, our investment, our footprint. And I think, again, having talked with people in particular in automotive and BMW, amongst others, it's going to be very, very worrying.
Well, I think the broader implications are significant. Airbus is a special case, but Airbus is simply an extreme example of a global value chain. And global value chains are central to the functioning of the international trading system and of the international economy more generally. And the disruption that Brexit has, or Brexit will, imply for that global value chain is analogous to the disruption that could pertain if there were disruption to the dispute settlement system or to world trade more generally. So I think that Airbus gives us a sense of the kinds of problems that are likely to arise more and more in the future as this moves forward. I think Patrick's given us a very good sense of some of the administrative and legal problems that Brexit raises, Suzanne may have the answer: illegal trade. So, Suzanne, seriously, an increasingly important part of the world economy, or concern about the world economy, is growing importance of illegal trade. So why don't you give us a perspective on how you see that as fitting into the international economic environment?
Thank you, Jeff. So the lens in which I see economic challenges might seem a little bit short-sighted or a little bit narrow as compared to everyone else, because my career has been in law enforcement and prosecuting and investigating organized crime and financial criminals. But along with that has come the opportunity to work on policy issues across the globe with Africa, Asia, South Africa, South America. And what we've learned is that our similarities in this area of law enforcement are greater than our differences, and that really our goals are almost universal. The challenges, of course, are how to reach those goals. So when I talk about the global effects of illegal trade, I'm here to say that it absolutely taints every country. It weaves countries together unwillingly, in alliances that are woven by the efforts of unscrupulous criminals and organized crime groups, and preys upon the weaknesses of the infrastructures and legislation. It promotes greed and corruption, and ultimately affects the financial systems, reputations, and economic stability. Taints with all of the massive amounts of money that are generated through illegal trade. That money has to go somewhere. It has to go into the financial system. It has to go into assets and to continue on with these organizations. So just some basic thoughts when I'm talking about illegal trade or trafficking and the impact on the economy. There's little hard evidence on the totality of the scale and amounts, because obviously countries, industries look at a specific thing that is most pressing to them at the time. But just to look at some of the top revenues producing illegal trades, the amounts are absolutely jaw-dropping. Illegal drugs, $320 billion, and we're talking a year. Counterfeiting, $460 billion of various goods. Human trafficking costs $150 billion. Wildlife trafficking, $23 billion. Timber trafficking, $10 billion. Organ trafficking, $1 billion per year. And these figures are cold cash, if you will. They don't take into account the effect of the human toll and the reputational toll, the death involved. As I said, for obvious reasons, governments particularly tend to focus on the thing that is most harmful to them at the time in terms of trade, whether it is drugs, wildlife, nuclear trafficking, whatever, fissile materials. But I don't think that you will be surprised to know that criminals aren't so discreet, so discriminating. And what we've seen in the world of illegal trafficking is that once there's a pipeline in place, once I can get from country A to country B, and the pipeline can maintain below the radar, I can find a criminal group to send various types of products through that pipeline, whether it is wildlife trafficking, whether it's humans, whether it's organ trafficking, just to have the pipeline in place with the various organizations. I mentioned at the outset that one of the things that happens with illegal trade is that it forges partnerships between unwitting countries, whether they're neighboring countries or whether they're countries quite on opposite continents, on opposite sides of the world. And the links are forged by organized crime, which we could call a new global enterprise. They've assessed the demand, who wants it, and they've assessed the supply, who has it. And they spend their enterprise developing how to run this below the radar of law enforcement. They have a supply chain, they create new lines, they co-opt old ones, and they spread enough payoffs to the vulnerable or the greedy to ensure that the organizations continue on with this large billion-dollar payouts. And as has always been the case with law enforcement, the bad guys have more money, more tools, more guns, and sometimes more influence, sadly, in one state, one country, or a region to pour into the issue of illegal trade. If I've totally depressed you, please have heart, because I think there's a basic calculus about how to move forward, and then one thing that I see that is really possibly an answer. So the basic thing that we look to, sort of the aspirational, holistic approach, if you will, is to enhance private sector engagement, to fine-tune legislation, to increase the training for judges, prosecutors, investigators, to understand the drivers for the consumer demand, and invest in public awareness. And to the extent possible, for those countries that find themselves in these sad, unwitting partnerships, to really have the conversation, to collaborate, to cooperate, to share information as much as possible. As I said, these are sort of aspirational, and they have to, you can't just do one without the others. They sort of march along together. But the one thing I will leave you with that I believe is the sort of coming potential answer, but it's certainly part of the solution, is public-private partnerships. When we now, we've heard sadly of countries at leadership gaps and that ongoing problem. But what we do see are industries that are sort of stepping up, and they're not just looking at their discrete interests. This is my product, this is the thing I'm concerned about, but they are instead looking to forge relationships with civil society, with NGOs, with governments, for the sort of greater good, for the bigger issue of combating trade. And I think that that is really an answer to the problem. So thank you.
Suzanne. One thing I'd point out, which you alluded to briefly, is that illegal trade is not just a problem from the standpoint of the international trading system, but that much of this illegal trade, particularly in drugs, has given rise to a real distaste in a lot of countries for existing governments that don't seem to be able to control it. If we look whether in the Philippines or in Latin America, other parts of the world, at least some portion of the kind of populist upsurge that we've seen has been in response to the sense that the government can't control things like drug trafficking. So I think it is not just a problem for the international trading system, it's a problem for the national governments of many of the countries of the world, and a very serious problem. We have only to look at the current campaign, presidential campaign in Brazil, to see what happens when a country starts to lose control of illegal activities within its borders. So thank you for that. I want to turn now to Ito. Ito, for the last an hour and a half or so, we've heard a whole series of problems that have arisen, whether in the WTO, in global value chains, in the international trading system, in the international financial system. In many ways, Japan is caught in the middle in almost all of them, between the US and China, between the US and Korea, between Russia, China, and the United States. So I'd be interested in knowing how it feels to be squeezed like this and what the Japanese are planning to do about it.
Let me just come back to macroeconomy, which may be very important aspect of the issue we are discussing. And probably Japanese experience may provide some kind of implication for that. Now, because I'm an economist teaching at the university, I want to just mention supply and demand. It's very important. And what Kemal in the beginning of this session, in the previous session, mentioned is a very serious problem of supply side. That is what Larry Summers called secular stagnation, and what Robert Gordon just discussed, the total factor productivity of the United States were very stagnant for last 30 years. Now, if you have a very stagnant supply, you can't do anything. Well, you may be able to stimulate the economy by stimulating demand for a while, but what happened now is maybe stimulated too much. So it just stimulated too much, too many debt and very high price of the stock, and there may be more risk of just falling down. However, demand stimulation is very important when it is very stagnant. And that is what we experienced after the crisis of 2008. And Japanese experience was a typical case. As you probably know, we have a very bad situation, what we call deflationary trap. It was in trap. So we have to get out of the trap. And Abenomics is very, very unorthodox, ultra expansionary policy combined with inflation target. And we found it was successful. So in order to just get out of the very serious lack of demand, you may need some kind of a very unorthodox method, and similarly did by EU and United States. Now, the problem we have, we were successful to change the trend. However, inflation rate is never going up to 2%, and potential growth rate is in very low of 1%. So that just implies supply side is not catching up. So then that is just the next problem. So what happened now is we have abundant demand. So that was just contribution of the previous the macroeconomic policies. But then what happened is whether we can just prepare for sudden drop of demand. And unfortunately, there are many of the issues we can think of as a source of the disturbance in the next couple of years. And we have already talked a lot about Trump's administration. So let me talk about US-China trade relations. That is very serious for two countries. But from macroeconomic viewpoint, it may be more serious because it can be a cause of the triggering of the dropping of demand. I have a lot of opportunity now talking to Japanese business people, what they are doing, responding to this kind of a trade conflict. And most of them mentioning shifting production location from China to other places. Because most of the multinational companies, not only Japanese, American, European, just spreading the production location in many countries in order to just prepare for the risk. So when the risk is more visible, it is very natural for the companies to just shifting production. And also I have asking the question whether you are going to make an increase in investment in China. And then, well, they're not very sure because they have to wait and see whether there is going to be an increasing risk or not. So if this kind of a trade conflict is just changing the mindset of the industry, not only Japan, United States, Europe, and that can have a very important implication for the global economy.
It seems ironic that maybe a little bit optimistic, but in as much as Japan seems to have, if not solved, addressed its demand insufficiency problem, it's now facing very serious supply side problems. So it just goes to show that you can't win. But I think it highlights the fact that in an interdependent international economy, no one country can hope to address all of its economic problems without taking into account what's happening in the rest of the world. I came under severe attack in the interim for not addressing or not recognizing questions from the audience. So I am going to recognize questions from the audience. I should warn you, however, two things. First of all, there are microphones circulating. And the second is that with the brightness of the lights, I can't see very well. So you'll have to raise your hand high. And I think is it Danielle? Does someone have a microphone over here? We do have a microphone. Yeah, okay, thank you. Please identify yourself, Daniel.
Tell you what it struck me, and I'll hook up with the first panel. What I think has been missing prominently in the first panel was the military component, ingredient of strategizing in the global space. It may be, when it comes to international trade benefits, fine with this logic. But when there is such a clear shift of power in the global space in China, I mean, look how much we focus on China. It's like China is the economic for everybody, primarily the United States. And it may be that there is much more than trade and economic logic. It's military. It's the balance of power. And this is the case. It's not only Trump. There could be also the military establishment. So I think it's much more at stake. Secondly, what's also surprising is you have not mentioned, and I'm talking about the first panel as well, climate change. That's more of an existential threat than, I don't know, artificial intelligence not being able to cope with labor dislocation. So this is also something we should pay attention to. And I would have loved the first panel to address these issues.
Well, you have a second panel. Would anybody like to address either of those issues? The power shift seemed, or the notion that this is a broader shift in power seems relevant to, certainly to the WTO and also to Japan's position. If you have anything you'd like to say about that, Carl or Ito?
Okay, we are caught also in this struggle between the US and China. But of course, we have no military aspects in this. But I would like to say that our understanding is, or my understanding is, that the Chinese internal powers will do whatever is necessary to improve the fate of people internally. This is how they get the legitimacy for staying in power. So I think the military power is only an annex to trying to improve the lot of the Chinese people.
I'm not specialist about just the military system, but I'd like to just mention a very related issues. When I was talking to the American politician, not Mr. Trump, more just also Trump, what he said is the tax on export of the car, say, to the United States only 2.5%. And the tariff on to China is something like 20 to 25%. And when Chinese companies making investment in the United States, they can. But when American companies do invest in the United States, in China, they can't have more than 50% of the share, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be very difficult confliction between the two big countries. Now, if you look back to just the international trading system in the past, it is more or less just the system among the developed countries. They have a negotiation, and they are very nice to other developing countries to provide just lower tariff and so forth. But when the developing country or emerging country start challenging the order of that country system, then there's conflict. We had many experience in Japan for the trade restrictions and forced the expansion of import and so forth. So in the case of Japan, it's a process or history of adjusting our system to the Western type of the liberal. But now, because China becomes so big, and it is so conflicting with the traditional system, so I think it's very difficult to solve the problem. And then comes just the power issue is very much related to that.
Yeah, I can't address the climate change issue, but I think that in some sense, the rise of China is at the root of many of the issues. Let's not call them problems, because I don't want to blame China for the problems, but the fact that China has become such an extraordinarily important part of the international economy has had a whole range of effects, both domestically and internationally, and helps explain why we're seeing such disruption in both domestic and international politics, militarily and economically. So I think you're right to focus on that. But I want to get to the next question over here.
Je vous remercie. En fait, ma question, alors, Monsieur Leïchoubi,
Hold on, you'll have to, for those who don't speak French, you'll have to put on your...
Sorry, I don't speak English.
That's all right.
I don't speak very well English. I prefer to speak French. It's
That's fine.
easy for
That's
me.
fine.
Sorry.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, it's
Patrick,
okay.
you don't need it. He's going to speak in French, so for those who don't speak French.
Oui, non, en fait, ma question est plus relative au premier panel, mais elle a une incidence très forte sur le second. Mon ami Thierry, dans son intervention, a un peu ouvert une piste en souhaitant un élargissement du débat, un approfondissement de la question. Alors je me demande, en écoutant les différents amis, les différents analystes, si nous ne sommes pas frappés d'un petit peu de timidité. C'est-à-dire si dans l'analyse critique, il ne faut peut-être pas aller un peu plus loin. Et je me pose la question si cette timidité n'est pas illustrative d'une autre question un peu plus profonde. Je m'explique. Nous sommes en fait, à mon sens, la dimension géopolitique prend un poids extrêmement important. Et puis, il y a des mondes qui viennent, que nous ne pouvons pas ignorer, des questions plus complexes. Je résume. Les protagonistes ne sont plus les mêmes, parce que la crainte, c'est de croire qu'on peut substituer à l'ancienne URSS la Chine pour une bipolarité, pour un tête-à-tête, et le problème se réglerait, on analyserait le potentiel, la capacité des États-Unis et ceux de la Chine. Il me semble que la question ne se pose pas comme ça, parce que celle-ci recoupe le fait qu'il y a une sorte... C'est comme le traitement de la crise économique mondiale. On est persuadé qu'il faut des réajustements, et on évite des questions qui se posent qui sont certainement plus profondes. À mon sens, il y a des mondes qui viennent et que nous ne devons pas du tout ignorer. Je m'explique. Les protagonistes, la Chine est totalement insérée au commerce mondial. 380% d'augmentation entre 2000 et 2009. Elle détient 23% de l'endettement américain. Les USA eux-mêmes ne sont plus leaders d'un monde qui avait le quasi-monopole de la production technologique, de la dissuasion nucléaire, du droit des finances. Et donc nous sommes manifestement sur un monde qui est totalement en mutation, avec évidemment la question de l'endettement, mais surtout une coïncidence majeure entre la crise économique mondiale, qui a des effets fondamentaux, la fin de cycle de toutes les grandes questions de process technologiques pour la planète, que ce soit sur les questions écologiques évoquées par mon ami ministre roumain, etc. Et donc un émiettement de la pensée politique, un affaiblissement du politique. Et là, nous sommes dans un espace totalement différent qui va impacter aussi l'instrumentation qui est l'OMC, que sont toutes les autres. Alors, est-ce qu'on va faire une instrumentation qui va tenter de gérer l'éventuel compromis entre 2 ou 3 grandes puissances, ou est-ce qu'en fait nous allons avoir affaire à un monde complètement différent? Nous avons certains pays, certains espaces, certaines velléités recoupées dans les BRICS ou recoupées ailleurs, qui estiment qu'elles ont en face d'elles éventuellement l'ancienne triade, que les ont qualifiées comme de système monde hégémonique, et vous avez 2/3 quand même de la population mondiale, etc., avec des capacités. 4 des pays des BRICS ont le niveau le plus élevé des PIB PPA dans le monde. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, nous sommes en présence, à mon sens, d'une grande mutation qui concerne différents mondes et des mondes qui viennent. Et à mon sens, nous ne devons pas uniquement la résumer à un tête-à-tête sino-américain, auquel cas la Chine n'est plus celle que l'on croyait et n'est certainement pas l'URSS. Les USA ne sont plus ceux qu'on imaginait et certainement pas les USA de l'époque. Les mondes changent et donc est-ce que le débat ne devrait pas plus aller vers son élément central? Quels sont ces mondes qui viennent? Comment doit-on s'organiser? Parce que les espaces intérieurs de ces grandes puissances eux-mêmes mutent, eux-mêmes sont concernés. Je veux dire, les élites de ces propres pays se posent des questions. Comment inventer ces nouveaux mondes? Est-ce que nous aurons un débat entre ceux qui imaginent que la géopolitique de puissance va continuer à s'imposer, ou est-ce que ceux qui défendent l'école du partenariat mondial plus apaisé, avec une vision plus ouverte, vont réussir à se frayer un chemin? Je vous remercie. Je ne me suis pas présenté, Monsieur Laïchoubi, politologue, chercheur, membre de l'Académie royale d'Espagne et ancien ministre algérien. Je vous remercie.
Okay. Well, who would like to address that? Patrick, do you have something? You seem to... I think this raises a series of questions that Kemal Dervis did raise in the first panel. And to some extent, it seems to me that these are questions that will recur throughout our proceedings, because it has to do with what kind of world we are entering into and what kind of set of world problems we are likely to face and how to think about them. So I thank you for the intervention. It does go somewhat beyond the breadth or depth of what we're talking about, but it is relevant to some of the issues that have been raised. Patrick.
Je vais me permettre de répondre en français. Je pense qu'effectivement la période est extrêmement intéressante et qu'on en est à la conjonction d'événements majeurs qui accélèrent les uns les autres. Vous n'avez pas mentionné l'Inde, qui est également d'une grande force et une grande complexité et qui va jouer un rôle majeur à venir. Je pense que la manière dont les États-Unis actuellement déconstruisent les relations internationales, on l'a vu en particulier avec le JCPOA, on l'a vu quand ils sortent des accords de Paris sur la COP 21, et on voit du coup qu'on bascule à nouveau dans une incertitude des conventions internationales. Cette incertitude, elle impacte toutes les relations, y compris les relations d'affaires, y compris notamment les questions de défense, et je pense en particulier à l'Asie-Pacifique, où on voit une redistribution des cartes qui n'est pas du tout celle qu'on anticipait quelques années auparavant. On voit des alliances se nouer qui n'existaient pas auparavant. On le voit au niveau de l'Asie-Pacifique, ça se trouve aussi au niveau de l'Europe. L'Angleterre, c'est le premier budget de défense en Europe. Aujourd'hui, ils sont en train de regarder et de poser des alliances avec des pays hors Europe, en Asie et ailleurs, justement pour continuer à avoir des projets de défense et avoir une autonomie et une souveraineté. Les États travaillent entre eux. On le voit en Amérique du Sud et on le voit en Asie-Pacifique beaucoup, où auparavant, ils faisaient partie d'une communauté, je parle d'États entre guillemets, qui ne sont pas des grandes puissances. Il y avait une communauté d'États de puissance moyenne qui négociait avec des grands, et on voit que tout d'un coup, ils se mettent sur quelque chose qui est totalement asymétrique, qui est d'avoir une relation et une discussion avec un État beaucoup plus puissant. Et en fait, ça entraîne derrière des crispations et des résistances, et c'est un mouvement qui renforce en fait le protectionnisme, parce qu'ils se retrouvent encore plus exposés qu'ils ne l'étaient auparavant. Donc je crois que ça, ce sont des phénomènes qui changent en profondeur, et le phénomène un peu contraire, on en a parlé un peu ce matin, je pense, c'est la révolution digitale, pour faire court, qui est quelque chose qui est quand même un accélérateur pour beaucoup de ces pays. On voit que beaucoup de pays vont, là pour le coup c'est l'anglais, vont leapfrogger, vont aller à l'étape suivante. Ça se trouve en Afrique. On avions tout à l'heure l'honneur d'avoir le Premier ministre de la Côte d'Ivoire, mais d'autres pays d'Afrique également sont sur cette démarche très volontaire d'essayer d'aller tout de suite à l'étape suivante pour essayer justement de ne pas se retrouver tenus dans une place de petits pays, petites puissances, servant les grandes. Et donc je pense que les deux phénomènes aujourd'hui se conjuguent, et je pense que ça amène effectivement une très grande instabilité, et on voit aujourd'hui un peu le camp de ceux qui souhaitent effectivement un monde multipolaire qui se parle, et ceux qui regardent leur marché intérieur et se disent comment je peux le protéger, et les conséquences en dehors de ce marché intérieur ne m'intéressent peu ou pas.
Carl, I think the issue raised here in some sense is highly relevant to the WTO, because on the one hand we have concerns from the United States about the role of the WTO, but there have also been concerns such as those expressed by Kemal about the role of the WTO in encouraging, perhaps more effectively encouraging development in the poorer parts of the world. What are your thoughts on this?
The intervention started with the sentiment that nous sommes trop timides. And I don't know, when you say nous sommes trop timides, who's nous? Coming from the WTO, as a member-driven organization, the Secretariat unfortunately has no rights to initiatives, but the setup of the WTO was such, still is such, that one country has one vote. So this was actually the ideal world where the weak, the timid, would have a say. When you say we, me coming from the European Union, I always think of the European Union, and here I in fact think we are trop timide. Also this morning in the first panel, there was talk of the big powers, US, China. In fact, Europe is the bigger industrial power. And Europe, I'm very happy to be a European, because the Europeans always come up with very well-balanced proposals, good analysis, and trying to invest in the global common good. So I would be hoping that they would be less timid and take a stronger leadership role. That would be my wish.
I can point out, since you are too modest to do so, that in some ways, in perhaps a small way, the dispute settlement system is an extraordinary tool in the hands of the weak. Countries like Costa Rica have prevailed over countries like the United States in the dispute settlement system. And when that system was working, which it did has really since its inception, the US was obeying rulings against it on the part of Costa Rica. So I think that, I mean, it doesn't address the broader issues, but I do think that, in my humble opinion, a system based on the rule of law tends to work in the interests of the weak, not the strong. Please identify yourself, and is there a microphone here up front?
Thank you very much. I'm following up of the discussion, as my question is to Mr. Browner, the WTO issue. I agree that the dispute settlement mechanism is jewel in the crown of WTO. I am also concerned about the body itself, not only the crown, that is the decision-making process. And as you rightly said, it's member-driven, and it is not Secretariat's role to change the system. But in this world, to make a consensus of more than 150 countries is almost impossible. And last 15 years, we were trying to get out of that by making smaller informal groups, which led us nowhere. And now we are going to plurilateral groups and things like that, which is also parting from most favored nation, Article 1 spirit of WTO. How should we go about with this situation? Should we make a more formalization of green type council like United Nations, where they can decide things, or introduce majority system? If we just go with this decision making, that would lead us nowhere, is there a lot of people thinking. And I know that it's a member-driven organization, as you rightly said, but I just wanted to, if you can share your views as well. Thank you very much.
Go right ahead, Carl.
It's very difficult to foresee what the outcome of the current reform process is, because there is still this struggle in the membership about how do we handle the Doha development agenda. And there are some other members, like those who in Buenos Aires in December last year at the 11th Ministerial Conference decided to move forward with certain topics. So we have now 4 very intensively working groups of varying member states on e-commerce, on investment facilitation, on micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, and on services regulation. So you mentioned that in the past we had plurilateral agreements, but they were MFN. Like when we concluded, I think among 63 member states, the extension of the list of IT products that would be dealt, traded, custom-free, this was made MFN. This follows the most favored nation principle, and all those who are not part of it are, the others would say, free riders. How we are going to develop the negotiation arm of the WTO in smaller groups with agreements among only a few, invitation for everybody to participate, or whether we try to maintain a consensus among 164 remains to be seen.
Okay. Well, I want to point out, first of all, that this is only the first session. Do we have another question? Okay, last question in the middle here. I promised Thierry to get us back on track.
Okay,
we'll
thank
finish
you.
more or less on time.
Okay, this is a short question, and as I consider we are still in the preliminary session, I would say that I didn't miss it, but I noticed that you didn't mention among the global contemporary problems today, the migrations, which happens to be an obsession in Europe, for instance. Does it mean that that type of obsession is not justified? How do you evaluate? Thank you, as a global problem.
Would anybody like to address the issue of migration? It is related to illegal trade. I will point out, in the interest of promotion, I suppose, that we do have a panel coming up at 3 o'clock this afternoon on migration and the future of multiculturalism. But it is true that we have not addressed it in the 2 panels this morning. Would someone like to say something about it? Go ahead.
I'll just say it is an obsession with everyone, I believe. And I was only going to point out that there are sessions about this directly. So I really, but you are not alone in your obsession. I think it's concerning of everyone. And I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm waiting to hear.
I think that it does fit into this broader characterization of the populist upsurge that we've seen, which varies from country to country, where there's concern on the part of many that the ability of national governments to pursue policies that may be in line with the desires of their citizens have been lost either due to globalization or to European integration or to some other factor. I don't happen to share those concerns, but we know now that even in countries that have virtually no immigrants, immigration has become a hot button issue. So I too am looking forward to the session later on today, and I'm sure that it will come up over and over again during our proceedings. In the meantime, in the interest of maintaining some semblance of a schedule, I want to draw this second session to a